Okay, so transitions can also be used to link paragraphs together. And oftentimes when you're linking paragraphs together, you will need a transition sentence or sometimes even two, not just a word or a phrase. It just depends. I mean, it depends on the situation, obviously, but just know that sometimes it will take a transition sentence, not just a transition word, to link paragraphs. And here is an example of that. And this is from that same article about proofreading that we've been looking at. Now, we already looked at this previous paragraph about short-term memory and how it can present problems with proofreading to inexperienced writers. Let's look at a transition sentence here. I'll just read you the end of that paragraph again. Because inexperienced writers are often slow readers, they frequently fail to notice their errors. The short-term memory cannot sustain words from the beginning of a sentence through to the end of that sentence. In spite of the problems that inexperienced writers may have with simply reading their written work, most of them can learn to proofread effectively. But proofreading must be taught. It is not innate. Now, I want you to notice something with this. This is a pair of transition sentences here that's going to lead us from this previous paragraph about short-term memory and the problems it presents for proofreading, and then the next paragraph, which we'll look at in a moment. So notice that the first transition sentence here in the blue refers back to that previous paragraph, because the previous paragraph is all about the problems that inexperienced writers may face with reading their written work. So they say, in spite of those problems, most people can learn to proofread effectively. And now we move on into what will be the purpose of the next paragraph, which is that proofreading has to be taught. It's not an innate thing. It has to be taught. Deficiencies in proofreading skills are usually due to a lack of instruction, rather than carelessness, laziness, lack of motivation, dishonesty, or even mediocre verbal skills. In other words, general verbal ability is a prerequisite for proofreading, but there are no specific skills that guarantee proofreading ability. Thus, my teaching of spelling or mechanics does not improve proofreading. Although writers may make fewer errors as a result of that instruction, their ability to locate errors does not improve. The only way to improve proofreading is to teach proofreading. Furthermore, I find it helpful to teach student writers more than just the strategies for proofreading. Now, we have another transition sentence at the end that's going to lead us into another paragraph about the specific proofreading strategies that she teaches her students. And I want you to just notice the flow here and how good that flow is. Let's go back to the previous page here. So we've got this setup here that short-term memory creates these problems with proofreading for inexperienced writers. Then we've got a transition here. In spite of those problems, referring back to the previous paragraph, in spite of those problems, most people can learn to proofread effectively, but it's not innate. It has to be taught. And then in the next paragraph, the author continues to develop that idea that this has to be taught. It's a skill. Deficiencies in proofreading are usually due to a lack of instruction. So again, has to be taught. It's not innate. And then now at the end of that paragraph, we get another transition sentence that lets us know the next paragraph is going to get real specific about how you teach it and what the strategies are. So we've got a very smooth flow here from idea to idea to idea, and that is what you want to strive for in the body of your paper. Each paragraph flowing into the next. Now, the first sentence of a paragraph will often refer back to the last sentence in the previous one. In that example that we just looked at, that's exactly what's going on. When you finish your first draft of a paper, check your paper for logical transitions. And you can do this by reading the first and last sentence of each paragraph and see, do they relate? And is there a nice smooth flow from idea to idea? Think of it like a chain. A link chain, and each paragraph is a link in that chain, and you don't want any weak links and you don't want any breaks in the chain. So you want everything to connect very smoothly and very logically. Now, sometimes you may find that you are having trouble linking one idea to the next, one paragraph to the next. Maybe that's because there's something missing between them. Here's the thing about transitions. They can't create connections between ideas. They can only highlight existing connections. So if it really doesn't make sense to go from this idea to this idea, if they really don't relate to each other and there's no, real logical connection, then just sticking a transition phrase in there is not going to create that connection. It can only highlight a connection that already exists. So, if you can't decide how to transition between two paragraphs or two ideas, ask yourself, is that because I'm missing something? Do I just need to develop the last paragraph a little more? Do I need to add something? Or is this paragraph just in the wrong place? And sometimes it's just going to have to be moved somewhere else. Now, that is scary for some people, to experiment and move whole paragraphs around like that. And I often have people tell me, I'm nervous to do that because I'm afraid I'm going to forget how I had it in the first place. And, I'll never remember where the order that I chose in the beginning. If you are concerned about that, I would recommend that you make a master document that you're going to save and that you're not going to touch, and then open 2 or 3 blank documents, copy and paste your whole paper, and then those can be the documents that you just play around with, and you can switch paragraphs around and move sections around and do whatever you want without worrying that you're going to forget how you originally had it. So let's review a little bit of what we've learned and talk about a paragraph checklist that you can use to check yourself once you've done a draft of your paper. Ask yourself, what is the topic sentence in each paragraph? Is there a topic sentence in each paragraph? Is it clearly stated? Do we have unity and coherence? Within each paragraph, does each sentence relate back to the main idea, to the topic sentence? Within each paragraph, do the sentences all relate to each other? Are there any sentences that don't seem relevant to the rest? Is there any of that Sesame Street, one of these things is not like the other stuff going on? As you read your paper, also ask yourself about development. How completely and effectively does each paragraph develop its main idea? Does any paragraph need more detail, more evidence to support its main idea? Do you need statistic? Do you need to paraphrase something from an outside source? Do you need an example to illustrate the point that you're making? Is each paragraph logically organized? Have you made effective use of transitions? Are the paragraphs clearly and logically linked, or do some of these paragraphs need to be moved around? Okay, so more tips for building a successful paper. Support your assertions. This is really important. And an assertion is just really any claim that you make. X is a serious problem. We need to make practice change Y. That's an assertion. Those are assertions. And assertions require support. And support can come in the form of evidence from your reading or from your review of the literature. It can be in the form of statistics, quotes or paraphrases from your sources, examples. It can be a synthesis of similar findings from multiple articles in the body of evidence. Sometimes support can be from your own research. Sometimes it can be experiential evidence, meaning your own experience or the experiences of others. Sometimes it can come in the form of expert testimony, so an expert in the field who's a recognized expert. It depends on what kind of paper you're writing. More often than not in scientific scholarly writing, the best thing to do is to provide evidence from the literature. So published, peer-reviewed articles, stats, paraphrases, synthesis of findings from published articles is usually going to have the most weight. Controversial assertions are going to require a little bit of extra work, a little extra support, because they're controversial. So anything that's a hard sell, anything that you can imagine some opposition to, may require a little bit of extra support. So that means extra evidence from extra reliable sources, and sometimes, if it's appropriate, other techniques as well, like an emotional appeal. That probably won't be appropriate for a lot of the scholarly writing that you might do, but if you're doing a presentation or if you're writing something more informal, if you're writing a letter to the editor or a persuasive piece, then an emotional appeal may be very appropriate in that instance. So it just depends on what you're writing. Another tip, cite your sources very carefully. according to the rules of your professor or the journal. Always make sure if you're submitting something for publication that you follow the author guidelines of the journal to a T, because the easiest and quickest way to get your paper rejected is to not follow those author guidelines. So part of citing your sources carefully and giving credit carefully is to take good notes as you're reading. You want to keep track of authors, page numbers, publication information, etc. Don't think that you'll remember to go back and put in your citations later. No. Cite as you write. Believe me, you'll regret it if you don't. And this is crucial too. Learn to paraphrase properly, because you want to use quotations very sparingly in academic writing, just very occasionally. So mostly you want to rely on paraphrasing and summary. And paraphrasing can be tricky. It's not just changing a couple of words around in a sentence. That's plagiarism. So you want to learn how to paraphrase properly. I have a blog post on this in my Whitney's Writing Tips blog, which is terrific. And I also have on the Canvas Writing Resources page, there is a PowerPoint presentation called Using Source Material that goes into this in great detail with examples and everything. So you should definitely check that out, or make an appointment with me and I'll teach it to you one-on-one. Now, we talked about organization and flow a moment ago. And I want to add that a lot of times the organization that we end up with in a paper is just whatever order the ideas happen to occur to us when we were writing the first draft. That's how a lot of us do it. And that is not necessarily the best organization for your paper, because we don't always think in straight lines, right? Which is totally fine and appropriate. But once it comes time to actually revise your paper to submit it, you want to make sure that your organization is purposeful, intentional, and logical, not random, not just whatever order things happen to occur to you as you were drafting. Make a decision about the organization. In whatever order your paragraphs and sections come in, it should be because you chose that and you thought about, is this the most logical organization? So experiment, move paragraphs around. Take my advice from a moment ago about having one master document that you don't touch, and make sure your organization is smooth and logical. Okay, moving on to conclusions. People often phone in the conclusion because at that point they're just kind of over it. They're sick of writing this paper, which is completely understandable. But your conclusion is your last impression, and it is just as important as the introduction. So what should a conclusion do? Well, it should concisely recap your main points, so sort of the bullet points, the main points of your argument or your paper. And in addition to that, it should also elaborate on the implications of that information or those ideas. So what does all this mean? You don't just want to stop at summary. You don't want to stop at just restating your main points. You also want to discuss what those mean. And that's how you make sure that your readers get your take-home message. At the end of the day, what's the take-home here? What's the bottom line? You want to make sure that's clear. So how do you do that? How do you talk about implications? Well, you can address the so what question. So what does this mean? Why is it important? What can we do with this information now that we have it? What should we do with it? What does all this mean for practice? Do we make a practice change as a result of all this? Do we not? Are there questions that still remain to be answered? Should we do some further research? What should future researchers focus on? What more do we need to know before we can proceed? What should happen now? What are the next steps? So you can kind of look at it like this. The conclusion first looks backward toward the main points and toward what you've just discussed, and then it looks forward to the future. What are the next steps, and what does all this mean for us? If you want your readers to think or do something specific, make sure that that's 100% clear and that's repeated in your conclusion, because that's your last chance to get that across. Think of the introduction and conclusion as bookends, because in a lot of ways their goals are similar. The conclusion should leave readers interested and looking toward the future, just as the introduction should leave them interested and looking toward the rest of the paper. All right, guys, I'm so glad that you took the time to watch this presentation. If you are one of my students, don't hesitate to get in touch with me to make an appointment if you ever need help with writing. And if you've just stumbled upon this on YouTube, thanks for spending this time with me today. And I hope it's been useful. Take care.